Hello everybody, I am going to walk you through the homework from Friday, just 3 practice problems. Number 1, the key is to first switch everything in terms of sine and cosine. So hopefully you are aware by now that cotangent is cosine of x over sine of x times secant is 1 over cosine of x minus cosine of x. Now what we need to do is go through and distribute this. So cosine times 1 is cosine of x over sine of x cosine of x minus, now this is really over 1, so we're just going to multiply the numerator by the numerator and the denominator by the denominator. So what we end up getting is cosine squared x over over sine of x. My mistake, over sine of x. I got sine by sine times 1. Okay, now that I have this, what I can do is cross off a few portions. So in my first fraction, in this one right here, I have a cosine on top and a cosine on bottom. So what happens is this and this cancel out. Now I'm left with 1 over sine of x minus cosine squared x over sine of x. Now you should notice, hey, I have the exact same numerator and denominator. So I can combine this to be, I'm going to go up here so I have room. The same denominator is sine of x. Now, on top, what do you have left? You should have 1 minus cosine squared x. All I did was combine this and this. Okay, that cosine squared x, that should be ringing a bell for you. Ooh, that's a Pythagorean relationship. If you manipulate the first Pythagorean relationship, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, you can get this down to, I'll write that down for you. So our Pythagorean relationship is sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1. If you minus cosine squared x minus cosine squared x, you end up getting sine squared x equals 1 minus cosine squared x. So this whole top portion reduces to this. So I get sine squared x over, the denominator is still the same, sine squared x. Okay, I'm going to erase this black portion down here that I just verified that Pythagorean relationship. This might be quicker. Maybe not. This might be quicker. Okay, now I have sine squared over sine. That should only be a sine. Sorry about that. Again, this should be the same as this. I accidentally wrote sine squared. Okay, so I have sine squared over sine. So if I expand that out, that's essentially sine of x times sine of x over sine of x. I can cross 1 off on top and bottom. I am left with sine of x as your final answer. Okay, on to number 2. Number 2 is probably the easiest one that we have. Number 2 says 1 minus sine squared x over sine squared x. So again, we need to break this down into the numerator and the denominator. The numerator, 1 minus sine squared x. You should have that Pythagorean bell going off in your head. So if we manipulated this Pythagorean relationship, sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1, if we want to get the black one to look like the blue one, all we need to do is minus sine squared x minus sine squared x. We are left with cosine squared x equals 1 minus sine squared x. You should be starting to get these almost memorized in your head. So what does that mean? Well, this whole numerator, this is the same as this, which is the same as this. So I can reduce that down to cosine squared x. The numerator is cosine squared x. I'm going to erase all of this blue stuff. Eventually. promise, I'm getting there. All right, come on, buddy. Okay, so my numerator is cosine squared x. My denominator is sine squared x. So if I combine these, cosine squared x over sine squared x, you should know that sine over cosine is the same as, cosine over sine is the same as cotangent. So cosine squared x over sine squared x is the same as cotangent squared x. Final answer. Okay, on to number 3. Number 3 is probably the most difficult one. Again, we need to fix this or set this up in between numerator, that's top, and denominator, the bottom. I'm going to do the numerator first. The numerator is cotangent plus tangent. So cotangent is the same as what? Cotangent is cosine of y over sine of y plus tangent is sine of y over cosine of y. Now, again, I want to combine this to be one large fraction, so I got to figure out what my common denominator is. My common denominator is just combine these two. I got to combine this and this. Therefore, my common denominator is sine of y, cosine of y. Okay, so what does the one on the left need? What does this need to look like this? Well, it needs a cosine, so I'm going to multiply it by cosine of y, top and bottom. What color should I use? I'll use green. What does this one need to look like this? Well, that one needs a sine of y. So the one on the left is going to be top cosine of y times cosine of y gives me cosine squared y over sine y, cosine y. Plus the one on the left, sine of y times sine of y is sine squared y over sine of y, cosine of y. Now I can combine these two. I have the same denominator. This and this are the exact same, so I can smash the two fractions together. My bottom is going to be sine of y, cosine of y. That's a multiply in between. The top is cosine squared y plus sine squared y. Hopefully you had that Pythagorean bell go off in your head. Cosine squared plus sine squared. That should give me 1 over sine of y, cosine of y. Okay, that is what my numerator reduces down to. Okay, now let's do the denominator. The denominator is cosecant squared of y. So what does cosecant squared of y reduce down to? Well, cosecant is the same as 1 over sine. So this is the same as 1 over sine squared y. So if I want to do, I'm going to kind of box this off. So my numerator is here, my denominator is here. So if I want to do now my numerator, 1 over sine of y, cosine of y, over my denominator is 1 over sine squared y. Okay, what I can do is rewrite it like this. Well, dividing is the same as, write it like divided by 1 over sine squared y. Again, fraction divided by a fraction, keep switch flip. So this turns into 1 over sine y, cosine y, times, flip the fraction, sine squared y over 1. Okay, now I can cross reduce. I have a sine on top, and I have two sines. I have a sine squared on top, so essentially two sines and one sine on bottom. So what can happen now is one sine crosses with my squared. Again, what I essentially did there, I'll do that a little slower, is sine squared. This is the same as sine of y times sine of y over, again, I'm just multiplying that by this one right here. 1 times sine squared y is this. The bottom, I'm going to do this times this. I'll put it right here. Essentially, I'm not really combining anything, though. It's just sine of y cosine of y times 1, but we don't write the times 1. Now what cancels out? Well, I have a sine on top. I have a sine on bottom. Those cancel. I'm left with sine of y over cosine of y. Now, if you look at your trig identity sheet, sine over cosine, that just reduces down to the tangent of y. That should be your final answer. Okay, hope this helped.